The summer of 1991 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, was thick with humidity and an uneasy stillness. In the Oxford Apartments, a beige nondescript complex in a marginalized neighborhood, residents went about their daily lives, largely unaware that they were living beside a void where humanity had ceased to exist. On the night of July 22nd, that void was finally exposed, not by a sophisticated federal task force or a long-term surveillance operation, but by a single moment of desperate courage. It was close to midnight when a patrol car flagged down a young man running through the streets. His name was Tracy Edwards. He was 32 years old, breathless and terrified. On his wrists, dangling uselessly, was a pair of handcuffs. He told the officers, Rolf Muller and Robert Routh, a story that sounded disjointed and frantic. He spoke of a man in a nearby apartment who had held him captive, a man who had brandished a knife and threatened his life. Edwards had managed to strike the man and flee, running blindly into the night until he saw the sanctuary of the police lights. The officers, initially viewing this as a domestic dispute or a misunderstanding, agreed to accompany Edwards back to the apartment to retrieve the key for the handcuffs. They arrived at apartment 213. The tenant, a 31-year-old man with blonde hair and heavy-rimmed glasses, opened the door. He was calm, polite, and cooperative. He invited the officers inside. His name was Jeffrey Dahmer. What happened in the next few minutes would shatter the psyche of the American public and rewrite the textbooks of criminal psychology. As the officers entered the small, one-bedroom apartment, they were immediately hit by a distinct chemical smell, a mixture of bleach, industrial cleaners, and something else, something organic and decaying that they couldn't quite place. Dahmer stood by, visibly relaxed, offering excuses for the handcuffs, claiming it was a consensual situation that had gotten out of hand. Officer Miller began to look around the apartment. It was sparsely furnished, cluttered with boxes and an aquarium. In an attempt to find the key to the handcuffs, or perhaps sensing that something was fundamentally wrong, Muller opened the drawer of a bedside dresser. Inside, he did not find a key. He found a Polaroid photograph. It was an image so stark, so undeniable in its depiction of a deceased human being, that Muller immediately realized this was no longer a welfare check. It was an active crime scene. These are real, Muller uttered to his partner, holding up the photograph. A struggle ensued. Dahmer, realizing the facade had crumbled, resisted physically for the first time, but he was quickly overpowered and pinned to the floor. As the officers secured him, they began to look further. What they found in apartment 213 was a catalog of horrors that defied comprehension. It was a makeshift laboratory of death, containing evidence of multiple victims. In that moment, the quiet man from apartment 213 was revealed to be one of the most prolific and disturbing serial offenders in history. But the arrest was only the beginning. The subsequent investigation would peel back the layers of a 13-year nightmare, revealing systemic failures, missed opportunities, and the terrifying ability of a monster to hide in plain sight. To understand how Jeffrey Dahmer reached this point of total moral collapse, forensic psychologists and investigators had to look backward, far beyond that humid night in 1991. They had to examine the progression of a pathology that began in adolescence. Born in 1960, Dahmer's early life appeared, on the surface, to be relatively standard. However, beneath the veneer of a suburban upbringing, there were signs of profound isolation and a disturbing fascination with biology and anatomy. Teachers and classmates later recalled a boy who was withdrawn, a class clown who used erratic behavior to mask a deep-seated loneliness. But the true darkness remained hidden. His first crime occurred in 1978, just weeks after his high school graduation in Ohio. The victim was a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. But this initial act of violence was not a sophisticated crime. It was impulsive, driven by a fear of abandonment and a warped desire for control. Dahmer buried the evidence of this crime in the backyard of his childhood home, effectively burying his secret for nearly a decade. Following this first tragedy, there was a dormant period. Dahmer attempted to integrate into society. He attended college briefly, joined the Army, and eventually settled in Milwaukee. To the outside world, he was a laborer, a quiet neighbor, a man who kept to himself. But internally, the compulsion was festering. The investigation revealed that his descent into serial offending began in earnest in the late 1980s. The Oxford apartments became the epicenter of his activities. He selected his victims carefully, often frequenting bars or bus stops, looking for young men who appeared vulnerable or in need of money. He would lure them back to his apartment with promises of payment for posing for photographs or simply to share a drink. Once they were inside apartment 213, the trap was sprung. The forensic investigation into the Milwaukee murders was a monumental task. When the hazardous materials teams and forensic anthropologists arrived at the scene in July 1991, they were faced with the challenge of identifying remains that had been deliberately concealed and destroyed. The sheer volume of evidence required a methodical, clinical approach. Every inch of the apartment was processed. The floorboards, the carpeting, the walls, and the plumbing were all examined for trace evidence. Identifying the victims became the primary focus of the Milwaukee Police Department. And these were not nameless drifters, as Dahmer had initially implied. They were sons, brothers, and friends. They were aspiring models, musicians, and laborers. They were men like Anthony Hughes, a deaf man known for his vibrant personality and style. They were men like Konerak Sinthasomphone, whose tragic interaction with the police would later become a focal point of public outrage. They were men like Errol Lindsay, whose family would later become a powerful voice for victim advocacy. The process of identification relied heavily on dental records and the emerging science of DNA profiling. In 1991, DNA technology was not as rapid or advanced as it is today, making the task even more arduous. While forensic dentists worked tirelessly to match post-mortem evidence with medical records provided by grieving families who had been searching for their loved ones for months or even years. As the identities were confirmed, a heartbreaking pattern emerged. The majority of the victims were young men of color. This realization sparked a firestorm of controversy and grief within the Milwaukee community. Questions were raised about how a man could murder 17 people over the course of a decade without being detected. The investigation highlighted a painful reality. Many of the victims came from marginalized communities where missing persons reports were not always prioritized with the urgency they deserved. The most damning example of this systemic failure was the incident involving Konerak Sinthasomphone. Months before his final arrest, police had been called to the Oxford apartments regarding a dazed, injured young man found in the alleyway. Dahmer had convinced the responding officers that the boy was his adult partner and that they had simply had a lover's quarrel. Despite the protests of neighbors who insisted the boy was a minor and in danger, the police allowed Dahmer to take the victim back inside. The revelation of this incident during the subsequent investigation caused a massive breakdown in trust between the community and law enforcement, leading to protests and eventual reforms in police procedure. While the forensic teams worked to identify the victims, the legal system began to prepare for what would be one of the most scrutinized trials of the century. Jeffrey Dahmer had confessed. He did not deny his actions. In the interrogation room, he spoke with a flat, monotone affect, detailing the crimes with a clinical detachment that chilled even the most seasoned detectives. He waived his right to a lawyer initially, seemingly resigned to his fate, or perhaps relieved that the double life was over. Because there was no question of factual guilt, Dahmer admitted to the killings and the physical evidence was irrefutable. The trial hinged on a single, critical legal concept: the insanity defense. In the state of Wisconsin, the burden was on the defense to prove that, at the time of the crimes, the defendant suffered from a mental disease or defect that caused him to lack substantial capacity to either appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct or conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. This is a high bar to clear. It is not enough to be disturbed or depraved or deeply abnormal. To be found legally insane, one must be unable to understand that what they are doing is wrong. The trial began in January 1992. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere tense. Security was tighter than it had ever been in the Milwaukee County Courthouse. The world watched as the prosecution and the defense presented their narratives. The defense team argued that Dahmer was a man driven by a compulsion he could not control. They painted a picture of a man sick with necrophilia and other paraphilias, a man who drank to quiet the voices in his head, a man whose descent into madness was total and involuntary. They utilized expert psychiatric witnesses to testify about his disorders, arguing that his obsession with creating a zombie-like companion, someone who would never leave him, was evidence of a complete break from reality. The prosecution, however, presented a starkly different view. They argued that Jeffrey Dahmer was cold, calculated, and manipulative. They pointed to the evidence of premeditation. He had worn condoms during some of the assaults, indicating a concern for his own health. He had negotiated prices with victims. He had successfully lied to the police during the Konerak Sinthasomphone incident. These were not the actions of a man who didn't know right from wrong, the prosecution argued. These were the actions of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and was taking active steps to avoid detection. The district attorney, E. Michael McCann, emphasized the deliberate nature of the crimes. He showcased the tools Dahmer had purchased, the modifications he made to his apartment to conceal the evidence, and the careful selection of victims. The prosecution's narrative was one of a predator who preyed on the vulnerable and used the cover of societal indifference to mask his atrocities. One of the most powerful moments of the proceedings came not from the experts, but from the families. The courtroom was filled with the relatives of the 17 men. Their presence was a constant reminder that this was not just a legal debate about definitions of sanity. It was a reckoning for the loss of human life. The pain in the room was palpable. The jury was tasked with a monumental decision. They had to wade through weeks of gruesome testimony, viewing evidence that was distressing and traumatic. They had to listen to the clinical dissection of a man's mind while staring at the man himself. who sat motionless at the defense table, staring blankly ahead. On February 15th, 1992, the verdict was read. The jury rejected the insanity plea. They found Jeffrey Dahmer to be legally sane at the time of the murders. He was fully responsible for his actions. The judge sentenced him to 15 consecutive life terms, a total of more than 900 years in prison. Wisconsin did not have the death penalty, so this was the maximum punishment the law could provide. The sentencing hearing provided a final platform for the families of the victims to speak. In a display of raw, unfiltered emotion, they addressed the court and the killer. Some screamed in anger, others wept in sorrow, and some spoke of forgiveness. It was a catharsis for a community that had been holding its breath for months. It underscored the reality that while the legal system had done its job, the emotional scars would never fully heal. Following his conviction, Dahmer was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. The authorities deemed him a high-risk prisoner, not because he was a flight risk, but because of the danger he faced from other inmates. He was initially kept in protective isolation. However, Dahmer eventually requested to be moved to a unit with more social interaction and work duties. He was assigned to cleaning detail in the prison gymnasium. It was there, on the morning of November 28, 1994, that the story reached its violent conclusion. Dahmer was working alongside another inmate, Christopher Scarver. Scarver, on serving a life sentence for murder, attacked Dahmer with a metal bar removed from a piece of weightlifting equipment. Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death, his life ending on the cold concrete floor of a prison bathroom, far from the cameras and the courtroom. The death of Jeffrey Dahmer brought a complex mix of reactions. For some, it was the final act of justice, a biblical retribution. For others, it was an easy way out, a denial of the decades of reflection and punishment he was supposed to endure. But with his death, the active chapter of the Milwaukee Cannibal was closed. The aftermath of the case left a physical and cultural mark on Milwaukee. The Oxford Apartments, the site of so much suffering, was purchased by a campus organization and eventually demolished. Today, the lot sits empty, a grassy void in the city landscape, where there is no marker, no plaque. The city, in many ways, chose to erase the physical memory of the building to prevent it from becoming a macabre tourist attraction. However, the legacy of the case persists in the changes it forced upon the system. The scrutiny placed on the Milwaukee Police Department led to significant reforms in how officers interact with minority communities and how domestic disputes and missing persons cases are handled. The tragedy exposed the dangers of implicit bias and the catastrophic results of ignoring the voices of the marginalized. Forensically, the case remains a case study in disaster victim identification. The techniques used to identify the fragmented remains of the victims helped refine protocols that are still used in mass casualty events today. The integration of anthropology, odontology, and DNA analysis in the Dahmer investigation set a precedent for thoroughness in the face of extreme evidence destruction. But perhaps the most enduring legacy belongs to the victims themselves. For years, they were overshadowed by the sensationalized nature of their killer. But as true crime has evolved into a genre that seeks to advocate rather than exploit, the focus has shifted. We remember Ricky Beeks, who had a daughter he adored. We remember Ernest Miller, a talented dancer. We remember the smiles and the potential of the 17 men who were taken. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is not just a story of a killer. It is a story of a city, a failure of safeguards, and the resilience of families who refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten. It serves as a stark reminder that evil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes, and it looks like a quiet, polite neighbor who opens the door and invites you in. As we look back on this case decades later, we are left with a lingering, uncomfortable question about the nature of safety and community. In an era where we are increasingly disconnected from our neighbors, where we often look away to avoid conflict, we must ask ourselves, if the signs were there, right next door, would we see them? Or would we too assume that the quiet man in apartment 213 was just keeping to himself? The resolution of the Jeffrey Dahmer case provided legal closure. But the questions it raised about mental health, police accountability, and the value we place on certain lives over others remain relevant today. It forces us to look into the shadows of our own communities and wonder what might be hidden in plain sight. Justice was served in the courtroom, but the vigilance required to prevent such a tragedy from recurring rests with us all.